Okay, so welcome everybody. This is our third session in this Bible survey overview. And tonight we're going to do the second part of the Old Testament, which we began last week. So in your Bible, of course, you're all familiar with this page, and we've seen it several times. It's the index page from your Bible, and there's the Old Testament. From Genesis all the way through Malachi, and it's got 39 books, the majority of which is in Hebrew, only a few small passages in Daniel or in Aramaic, as we saw last time. There you go, there are they all. And last time we looked at the Pentateuch, that's the 5 books on the left on the screen there, the books of Moses. And we also looked at the poetic books, that's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. And we did it that way because tonight we're going to be looking at the historical narrative of Israel, and also the books of the prophets. And there's no way that anybody can really understand or get a real grip of the books of the prophets, any of them, until you understand the historical narrative of Israel. So we've got to do the historical narrative books, which there on the screen are Joshua through to Esther, those 12 books. And you kind of got to marry them into the relevant prophets, who, there they are on the next slide. You've got 5 what we call the major prophets on the left. It's actually 4 of them. That's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And you've also got this very small brief book called Lamentations in the middle of them. So there's 5 books, but there's 4 prophets. Lamentations is a lament poem, an acrostic poem that was written by Jeremiah at the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 587 BC. And it was just his pouring, the pouring out of his spiritual grief at what happened to his city and the temple of God in Jerusalem. So it goes with the actual book of Jeremiah, which is just above it in the list there. Those are the major prophets. And the other list of 12 books on the right of the screen, they're called the minor prophets. And so it's Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So there's 12 of them. They're called the minor prophets, not because they're unimportant, but simply because many of them tend to be very brief. Obadiah, for example, is only 1 chapter. Joel's 3 chapters. Nahum, Habakkuk, they're 3 chapters as well. Haggai is only 2 chapters. So many of them are very brief, and in that sense, they're called minor prophets. So the first thing that we need to understand is to have a grasp of the simple historical outline of the history of Israel. That is the key to understanding history books, historical books, because they simply go through the history, event by event and person by person, and they marry into the prophetic books, which come later on. So the historical narrative books of the history of Israel take us from the time after the Exodus from Egypt, of the Israelites from Egypt, and their entrance into the Promised Land. And both the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, which is in Exodus chapter 20, were defining moments in the history of Israel. They came out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses, and they were constituted a nation together when God gave them his law covenant at Mount Sinai a few months later. Eventually, after several generations, they became a kingdom, and they were ruled by a series of monarchs. The first of those was King Saul, and he was followed afterwards by the 2 most famous kings of Israel, who are King David and King Solomon. After Solomon's death, this kingdom, which had established, which had only existed for 3 reigns, it was very brief as a united kingdom. The kingdom of Israel was split into 2 parts, and those 2 parts we call the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom is often referred to simply with its generic name as Judah, and the northern kingdom is known generically as Israel. So you need to be careful when you see references to Judah and Israel as to actually who's being referred to. Is it the northern kingdom, or is it the whole people? Or is it the southern kingdom in the case of Judah, or is it simply the tribe of Judah? You simply need to read the narrative carefully. These 2 kingdoms were eventually judged for their disobedience and idolatry. And these 2 judgments, firstly on the northern kingdom, which happened in 621 BC, and we'll go into that. In Judah, 587 BC, they were also very defining events in the history of Israel, particularly 587. The inhabitants of the northern kingdom, Israel, therefore, were exiled by the Assyrians. They were ethnically cleansed from their land by the Syrians in 621 BC, and they never returned. And therefore, it gives rise to this phrase, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Well, that's the northern kingdom, as it was. The inhabitants of the southern kingdom were exiled by the Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, during the period 607 to 587 BC. So it wasn't a single event, rather it was a series of events that happened over the period of 20 years. The first exiles were taken away in 607 BC, and the temple was finally destroyed and the city was destroyed in 587 BC. But the descendants of the southern kingdom were allowed to return after about 537 BC by the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great. Of course, 537 is 70 years after 607 BC, so the exile lasted around about 70 years. And by that time, in 537 BC, the Persian Empire had risen up and defeated the Babylonians, so Nebuchadnezzar and his descendants were no more. And it was the Persians that then ruled the then known world. The Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great was the one that made the decree to allow the Jews, as they were then known, to return 537 BC. So that's a very simple historical outline from the time of the Exodus to the return from the exile in 537 BC. Now, this timeline is the thing that we've really got to get our minds around. And it's this timeline, I've put it in again in this slideshow at various points, just so that we can see it again. And it's a kind of diagram that you really need to download, and to, as you're reading the Old Testament and reading the books of the prophets, it will do you a great deal. It'll be a great help to you if you just get this diagram up on your screen somewhere to actually understand when we're talking about, what period of time we're talking about in the particular book you're reading, and when one of these prophets, if you're reading one of the prophetic books, when that particular prophet actually had his ministry and prophesied to the people. So the timeline starts on the left of the screen, and by the time David came onto the throne after Saul in the monarchy period, we're talking about 1000 BC. That's the kind of year it was when King David reigned. And as I said before, he was followed by King Solomon, and Solomon was the greatest of the kings of Israel. That's when the geographical extent of Israel reached its greatest size. But then after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam came onto the throne. And you can read about this in the books of Kings. But the kingdom was divided in the time of Rehoboam. So from that point on in the timeline splits into two. And you get this line going off up towards the right. That's the brief timeline of the northern kingdom, or the 10 tribes which sided with Jeroboam, who was the first king of the northern kingdom. They were the 10 tribes of Israel, and generically they're either referred to as Israel or Ephraim. There are the names in the scriptures. And the prophets that were associated with the northern kingdom in their ministry were Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea, mainly those four. You can read about the ministry of Elijah and Elisha in the books of 1 and 2 Kings, and Amos and Hosea, of course, are books by themselves in the Minor Prophets. And so that's the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom, because of its rebellion against God and its idolatry, they were exiled throughout the Assyrian Empire, just ethnically cleansed away from their land and sent into exile into the Assyrian Empire in the year 621 BC. And they never returned. And of course, from that time on, they were known generically as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which is a phrase that you may have come across at various times. Down on the bottom line, after the kingdom is divided, you've got the history of the southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom consisted of 2 tribes, that's Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin was much smaller than Judah, the tribe of Judah. So generically, the southern kingdom is called simply Judah. And some of the prophets that ministered to the southern kingdom and preached to their kings and so on were people like Isaiah and Micah and Jeremiah. So we'll detail those a little bit more later. But you can see Amos and Hosea, they strictly to the northern kingdom, but Isaiah and Jeremiah to the southern kingdom on the line below. So if you follow the timeline across towards the right, along the bottom there, then you'll see that the inhabitants of the southern kingdom were exiled into Babylonia during the period 607 to 587 BC. So it didn't happen in 1 year like it did with the northern kingdom and the Assyrian Empire in 621. It actually happened over a period of about 20 years as they exiled group after group after group, and then eventually destroyed the temple and the city of Jerusalem and took over the land completely. And from that time onwards, after 587 BC, we enter into the period, or rather from 607 BC, strictly speaking, we enter into what's known as the 70 years of exile, or the Babylonian exile, which lasted for 70 years until 537 BC. You can see there in the diagram. During the 70 years of exile, 2 of the major prophets that ministered to the Israelites while they were in exile were Ezekiel and Daniel. So whereas Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah, they all lived in or around Jerusalem during the time of the southern kingdom, yet men like Ezekiel and Daniel, they were actually part of the exile. They were refugees. They were taken away. And Ezekiel spent most of his life in a refugee camp, what we would now call a refugee camp in Babylonia. But Daniel was a member of the aristocracy. He was related in some way to the royal family. And he found himself being taken to the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And he became a leading member of the Babylonian civil service during those 70 years of exile. And those 70 years of exile came to an end in 537 BC. And Cyrus the Great, who was then the Persian emperor, made the decree that the Jews could go back and rebuild their city and rebuild their temple. And so you come to the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which deal with that period. And some of the prophets that pertain to that period after the exile on the return of the Jews to the land are people like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So during that period, Judea was re-established. Many of the Jews, not all of them, but many of them did return. And the story in Ezra and Nehemiah is about the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the city and the repair work that was done on the walls of Jerusalem. But going back now to the historical narrative of Israel. So we've got this period where the history is divided because of the exile. So you have what is called the pre-exilic books and the post-exilic books. The pre-exilic book deal with the history before the exile. So that's Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles. And the books that deal with the post-exilic period after the Jews came back to the Promised Land were Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So in the pre-exilic period, we start with the book of Joshua, and Joshua basically describes the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua. That's when the Israelites had come out of Egypt, and they spent 40 years wandering around the desert, as we saw last week. But eventually, the next generation did go into the Promised Land, and it's the story of the conquest of that land, leadership of Joshua. After Joshua's death, the next period of time is known as the time of the Judges, hence the name of the book there, Judges. And it's a period of time where the country didn't have a king and they didn't have a central government, but they were really just a loose confederation of tribes. And they fell into a cyclical pattern of sin, repentance, and deliverance. So they would stay faithful to God for one generation. And then when their children grew up, their children weren't faithful to God and they went away from God. And God judged them, allowed them to be taken over by their enemies, subject to them. And then eventually they cried out to God for mercy. They repented from their sin and God delivered them. So God delivered them through what are known as judges, whom he raised up and anointed for that task. So you can read about men like Gideon and Samson and Jephthah and so on. Really tremendous stories of how God delivered the Israelites through them. Then you got this little book called Ruth. It's only 4 chapters, but it's a beautiful little book. And it describes the historical romance between Ruth and Boaz. And that's a prophetic picture of Christ and the church. Then we come to the book of 1 Samuel. And Samuel was the last of the judges. So it's Samuel's life and ministry which marks the transition from this loose confederation of tribes into the monarchy under King Saul. The people rose up one day and they told Samuel that they wanted to be like the nations around them, and the nations around them were all monarchies led by kings and emperors, and they demanded that God allowed them to be led by a king so that they could be like the nations. And so it's a story of how the nation transitions into this time of the monarchy under the first king, who was King Saul. And the rest of 1 Samuel describes the tragic ways, the tragic reign in many ways it was of King Saul and his eventual death on the battlefield. And King Saul's successor was David, young King David, who killed Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Well, he eventually became the king, and the reign of King David is described in the 2nd book of Samuel. That's 2 Samuel. And then after the death of David, you get King Solomon reigning, and the book of 1 Kings then describes the beginning of King Solomon's reign and how he compromised with the idolatry of the nations around them. He brought all of the gods of the nations into Jerusalem and the land, that he was going to judge them for that. So it's the story of how the kingdom was divided into 2 parts, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, as we've said. And the book of 1 Kings focuses mainly on the subsequent history of the northern kingdom, which were very, very ungodly kings and leaders, one after the other, hardly a godly man amongst them at all. And the big prophet that appears in the book of 1 Kings is, of course, Elijah. And it describes Elijah's ministry, particularly during the evil reign of Ahab and Jezebel, where Ahab and Jezebel brought Israel down to what it was really just the lowest point in their entire history. But during that time, God raised up this man, Elijah, to begin to deal and bring down this evil reign of Jezebel in particular. And Elijah's successor was a man with a very similar name. It's Elisha. So don't confuse the two. You've got Elijah first, and then Elisha second, his successor. So 2 Kings deals initially with the ministry of Elisha, again in the northern kingdom. And it's the story of how God anointed Elisha and some other people, some other men, to deal with the evil reign of Jezebel and to bring the northern kingdom out of that nadir that they'd fallen into. But it goes on generation after generation, describes all of these different leaders of Israel, and describes eventually the tragic exile of the inhabitants of the northern kingdom into Assyria. So the last few chapters of 2 Kings, the last few chapters in particular, very sad and very tragic history. Then we come to the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles, and 1 and 2 Chronicles basically take you through the same period of history, but they see it from the history from the viewpoint of the southern kingdom rather than the northern kingdom. So 1 and 2 Kings deal with the northern kingdom, but 1 and 2 Chronicles deals with the southern kingdom. So in 1 Chronicles, again, it goes back to the reign of David, and it's very, very similar in content to the book of 2 Samuel, which described David's reign. And then after David died, you then got the history of the southern kingdom of Judah from the reign of his son Solomon until their eventual exile into Babylonia and the fall of Jerusalem in 607 to 587 BC. So that's a potted history from the book of Exodus, and rather the book of Joshua when they went into the promised land, to the 2 exiles of the northern and the southern kingdoms away from the land that they'd entered. So again, you've got the timeline there. So what we've dealt with just now in that brief description was the bit on the left at the end, the monarchy, the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon, and then the history of the southern and northern kingdoms, where it divides in the time of Rehoboam, and the northern kingdom goes at the top, and the southern kingdom carries on along the bottom line. So the prophets, these are the major prophets, and you've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and this, as I said before, this small book of Lamentations stuck in the middle of them, which is just a poetic book of lament written by Jeremiah after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So it's very aptly placed there because it's really, in some senses, it's a continuation of the book of Jeremiah. So it should sit next to that one in the scriptural order. But Isaiah, one of the major prophets of Israel, and his book is very long. It's 66 chapters, and he must have lived to a ripe old age because he prophesied and ministered during the reigns of various kings of Judah, and but in the period before the exile, and he spoke much about the coming Messiah, and he also foresaw many end-time apocalyptic events. And then you've also got the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived in Jerusalem, and he ministered in the period that led right up to the exile into Babylon. So he was prophesying in the reigns of people like Jeconiah and Zedekiah and so on. And so he prophesied in that period, leading right up to the exile and to the destruction of the temple as well. And he also prophesied about the histories of some of the surrounding nations. You can read those in Jeremiah in the latter chapters. And he was the prophet that foresaw that God would ultimately make a new covenant in Israel, which we know as the new covenant, which we live in now with Jesus Christ as Messiah. And as I said before, you've got the book of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel didn't live in Israel or Jerusalem like Jeremiah and Isaiah did. Ezekiel prophesied, and the Spirit of God came upon him while he was a refugee in what we would now call a refugee camp in the province of Babylonia. So he was far away from home, and he'd lost his home, he'd lost his family, he'd lost probably most of his friends, and he was living a completely new life, which was a complete shock to him, of course. But God raised him up and spoke powerfully through him. And his main themes were the theme of the judgment that was going to come upon the city of Jerusalem very soon, within a few years, but also the ultimate restoration of Israel to the land, and God's ultimate restoration of the people to himself in the new covenant. And then you've got the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is many people's favorite book. And he lived in Daniel, like I said before, he was one of the upper classes. I think he was connected to the royal family. So he was creamed off by Nebuchadnezzar and taken straight to the palace in which Nebuchadnezzar lived. And he was groomed and trained to become a member of the civil service in Babylon. And he was so distinguished that he actually became the lead, what we would now call the prime minister in many ways, during his lifetime. And Daniel lived to a ripe old age, and he was first exiled. I think it would have probably been about 596 BC. And but he lived through the reigns of all of the emperors from Nebuchadnezzar onwards, until the Persians came in and took over. And he lived through Darius's reign and into the reign of Cyrus the Great. So Daniel's life and ministry spanned the entire length of this exile. So he must have been very young when he was taken into exile. The exile lasted for 70 years. Daniel was still alive at the end of it. He didn't return to Israel or to Jerusalem, probably because he was so old and because he was tied up in the civil service of the Persian Empire. So he stayed where he was and died there eventually. But Daniel saw many apocalyptic visions concerning the end times, and he was the one that prayed and interceded before God for the Jews to return to their land after the exile. So now we come to the minor prophets. And again, just like with the history, you had pre-exilic prophets, pre-exilic books and post-exilic books. Well, here you've got pre-exilic minor prophets and post-exilic minor prophets. So of these minor prophets that ministered and prophesied before the exile, so that's before 607 BC, you've got Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. And the post-exilic minor prophets, so these were men that preached and ministered after 537 BC, when the Israelites had come back to the land. You've got men like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So the pre-exilic ones, I made a list of them here. I've grouped them together in this way, just for ease of understanding. So over on the left at the top, you've got Hosea and Amos together. And the reason for that is that these two men both prophesied to the northern kingdom of Israel, and not to the southern kingdom. Like Elijah and Elisha prophesied only to the northern kingdom, so too Hosea and Amos prophesied to the northern kingdom as well. Over on the right, you've got Jonah, famous Jonah, that got swallowed by the fish, refused to obey God, and suffered a bit of discipline along the way until he eventually decided he was going to obey God. you've got Jonah and Nahum. And the unique thing about these two men is that God called them to be prophets, not to Israel or to Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms, but to prophesy to Assyria, the great empire of their day, and to Nineveh, its capital city, and to bring God's word to this evil Gentile empire. And yeah. Then over on the left, down at the bottom, you've got the other five, and that's Joel, Obadiah, Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. And these five men all prophesied at various times to the southern kingdom of Judah. So they prophesied a little bit later than Hosea and Amos, who were earlier, with the exception of Micah, because Micah also prophesied to the northern kingdom as well, but mainly to the southern. Joel describes the judgment of God through a locust plague. That's the main event that is in his book. And Zephaniah's message is about the destruction of Jerusalem during the time of the Babylonian captivity. But it's also strongly prophetic of the end times as well. So there again, you've got this simple timeline of history. And again, you've just looked at the minor prophets who were pre-exilic. So if you look carefully on the history of the northern kingdom, over on the left at the top, you've got Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea. So if you want to understand Amos, the books of Amos and Hosea, then you really need to get to grips with the history of the northern kingdom, which is in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, but particularly 2 Kings. So the book of 2 Kings dovetails nicely with the messages of Amos and Hosea. So if you read Amos and Hosea and you don't really understand what you're reading, then go back to the book of 2 Kings, get a grip of what's the message of 2 Kings is, and then that will help you to understand better what's in Amos and Hosea. And the same goes for the southern kingdom, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, etc. there. So if you're reading, for example, Micah, some of the statements that God made through Micah for the southern kingdom, then you need to understand, you need to read the books of Chronicles, particularly 2 Chronicles. And similarly, Jeremiah. There's a lot of history in the book of Jeremiah, but again, if you want to understand the context in which he spoke, then read about the reigns of the last 4 kings of Judah, from the time of Josiah onwards to Zedekiah, who was the final one. So then after 607, 587 BC, you've got this 70 years of exile when Ezekiel and Daniel prophesied. That's in a dotted line there. And then after that period, you've got what we call the post-exilic period. And these are the historical books that deal with that post-exilic period from 537 BC onwards, when Judah was re-established and the temple and the city were rebuilt. So the first of them is Ezra. And Ezra gives us the account of the return from exile of the Jews after the decree of Cyrus the Great in 537 BC. And it describes the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, who was the civic leader, and Joshua, who was the high priest. Ezra himself was a very significant teacher of the word of God, and he returned a little bit later after they'd begun to rebuild the temple. He returned later during the reign of Artaxerxes, the Persian emperor, and taught the word of God to the Jews, addressing especially the issue of intermarriage between the Jews and the surrounding nations. And some of the Jews had fallen into that mistake again of marrying non-Jews. And later on, in fact, almost 100 years later, you've got the about 100 years after the first initial return from exile in 537 BC, you've got the story of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem about 445 BC. And when he heard the story of how the walls of Jerusalem were still burnt with fire and all broken down, and they hadn't been rebuilt, and Jerusalem was still in a bit of a mess, he wept and he prayed. And the king gave him permission to return to Jerusalem, and Nehemiah led and oversaw the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And he also dealt with some of the civic regulations in the life of the Jews in the city, again, including the issue of intermarriage, which was one that Ezra, of course, had tried to address as well. But in between times, you've also got this other book, the book of Esther. And Esther, or Hadassah, which was her Jewish name, was a young girl that God promoted, as it were, and she became the queen of Persia. She married the emperor, which in her time was Xerxes the First, and that dates her to around 483 to 473 BC. And the main event of her story was her intercession before the emperor to save the Jews and the empire from total annihilation, which this evil man Haman had planned to do. He was going to kill them all. It's the story of how Esther saved them, interceding before the king. So back to the minor prophets, the post-exilic minor prophets, where you've got Ezra and Nehemiah there. They were the two books, historical books, that dealt with the period after the return from exile and the rebuilding of the city and the temple. During the time that the temple was being rebuilt, during the time of Zerubbabel, God raised up these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, and they both prophesied during the time of the rebuilding of the temple under Zerubbabel. So if you want to know, if you're reading Haggai and Zechariah and you don't really understand what it's referring to, then you need to read the book of Ezra. There it is. They are mentioned in the book of Ezra. So if you get a grip on the book of Ezra, then you'll understand a lot more. You'll find it a lot more easy to understand the what you're reading about in Haggai and Zechariah. And when this temple was rebuilt, it became known as the Second Temple. The first temple was the Temple of Solomon, which had been destroyed in 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. So this rebuilt temple became known as the Second Temple. And this marks the beginning of a period of history amongst the Jews, which we know as the Second Temple period. And it takes us from this time of Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah right up to 70 AD, when this Second Temple itself was destroyed by the Romans. So when Jesus lived and ministered, that was actually during the Second Temple period. But these two books, Haggai and Zechariah, they relate to the book of Ezra. And Zechariah also saw many visions which relate to the end times. It's a very interesting book to read. So if we go back here, go to Nehemiah, second down, you see that he returns around 445 BC. And as well as overseeing the rebuilding of the walls, he's also dealing with civic regulations and so on. Well, around about his time, or just after his time, you get the book of Malachi, or the prophet Malachi, being raised up. And Malachi was the last of the canonical prophets. And historians say that his message pertains to the period 445 BC to 425 BC. So it's around about just after the time that Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem and did what he did. And Malachi was raised up as a prophet to exhort the Israelites once again. They were backsliding, exhorting them to come back and live faithfully with God. So that's it. That's basically it. So I've tried to bring together the historical narrative books and the prophetic books, both the major and the minor prophets. And it is complicated. There is a lot of detail in that. But, you know, the minor prophets in particular are the one part of the Bible that hardly any Christians read, simply because when they do read them, they haven't a clue what they're talking about. And they haven't a clue what they're talking about because they don't know the historical books which give you the context into which those prophets spoke. So again, if you want to understand the prophets, for example, Haggai and Zechariah, then you read the pertaining historical books, which in their case, Haggai and Zechariah were Ezra and Nehemiah. So back on this diagram, they're all over on the right-hand side in the post-exilic period, where the kingdom, where Judah is being re-established, the temple and the city are being rebuilt, and that's when Ezra and Nehemiah go back, and God raises up these prophets. So the trick to understanding these parts of the Old Testament is to understand the history first, and then put each of the individual prophets in its historical context. So, for example, if you look at the 70 years exile period there, you've got Daniel and Ezekiel. Well, take Daniel. There's no point trying to match Daniel up to the prophets Elijah and Elisha, who preached previously over on the left, who preached to the northern kingdom, because Daniel was prophesying at a much later stage and in a different country to Elijah and Elisha and so on. So it is complicated. There is a bit of work to do, but that is the trick that I'm trying to teach you to understand these prophetic books, by simply understanding the historical books that they pertain to. And if you understand those books, if you read them through and get a good grip on them, then you'll have a much better understanding of the prophets who preached in those times. Okay? So thanks for listening. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope you've enjoyed it. God bless you.